Hello everybody and welcome to your next mock exam feedback video on the Cold War paper that you just completed in October. So similarly to the medicine paper, there'll be lots of information in this presentation, some indicative content, so things you could have said, maybe things you should have said, and some areas to watch out for, as well as some technique for each of the questions. So it works out as a good revision video as well for how to answer the questions, as well as some content to work with your paper. Again, with like medicine, try and have your paper open while you're watching this video so you can see what you wrote and maybe what you should have wrote. Okay, so let's get started. So this was generally done okay. The Cold War paper is hit and miss sometimes, particularly with some of the focus being on what happens because of rather than all of your knowledge. Lots of times people just write everything they know about a topic, which in the other papers might work. But in the Cold War paper, it's really important that you are talking about what happens after the events. So, some things to think about that's come out generally. Remember your time management. As always, with all of our exam papers, it's really important that you finish the paper and try and answer every single question. Okay? This paper, as I said, is more about what happened after the event than before it. So please make sure that you focus on that in your revision. Almost everything that you revise Cold War related, I guess a good thing to do would be, why was this important? Always add a little flashcard extra or an extra page on your revision. Why was this important? What did this lead to? All right, and then thirdly, the gist of every conflict in this story is that it led to suspicion and paranoia, as we know. All we keep saying, don't we, is this raised tensions, and it's generally this ego between both sides. Just keep that in mind. Generally for question 3 as well, you could pretty much always get away with talking about this raised suspicion and paranoia. Alright, so get into the habit of always using our connectives in each question. So the basics are this led to, resulting in, consequently, which meant that, there's loads you could have, but these are the main ones that will be fine as a result of. Try and get at least 2 of these in each paragraph, in every question, really, on this paper. As well as that, of course, are tension words. This worsened, this was significant because, this improved, this deteriorated. Anything that sort of takes on your story and makes it add some depth to it and add some tension to it. All right, so that's generally the overall general feedback. So let's go into the actual topics on this paper. And we'll start with question 1, the consequences question. So you're looking at about maybe 6 to 7 minutes on this. A little bit less if you can, but probably max 6 to 7. It's only worth 4 marks, so obviously you need to try and say 4 things. So the first question that you are asked on this paper is the consequences of the Hungarian uprising. So remember, this is a consequence question, okay? So you're going to talk about what happened because of the Hungarian uprising, not what caused the Hungarian uprising. What did this Hungarian uprising lead to? And you need to make it very clear in that opening sentence, as always, with every question in every paper. Be really clear what your opening point is so the examiner can see what this paragraph's going to be about. All right, so one consequence of the Hungarian uprising was, you'll see in a sec the possible answers you could choose for that. All right, remember your connectives again. Going to keep saying it because for this paper it is absolutely vital. This led to, due to, as a result, consequently, because of. These are all the connectives that will help you get your marks on this paper. Okay, oops. Okay, so let's have a little look at an answer for the first question. One consequence of the Hungarian uprising. 4 marks. Let's get straight into it. So our opening sentence, again, is really clear. Hopefully you can see that. One consequence of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 was the Soviet Union's harsh response. Really obvious to the examiner that this paragraph is going to be discussing what the Soviet Union did in response to it. Okay, as well, please remember, we do not need to talk about the causes of the Hungarian uprising because this question is asking what happened because of it. So let's start then. So Khrushchev's response to the uprising was brutal, to show his strength and control over the satellite states. Now remember, this is Khrushchev's first real challenge in taking over from Stalin, so he's got to be quite aggressive to show that he is the new boss and not to be messed with. Just keep that in mind, okay? And then Khrushchev sent 1,000 tanks into Budapest, resulting in intense fighting. So we've highlighted the resulting in there as a little connective. 20,000 of Naj's supporters were killed, corpses littered the streets and were dragged around on the tanks. Naj was arrested and later executed, leading to, again our connective being highlighted, a much more pro-Soviet government in Hungary led by Kadar. Despite Naj asking for help and despite a promise of help from the USA on the Radio Free Europe, no countries came to their aid, meaning, so another connective, all satellite states knew USA wouldn't help, ensuring total Soviet control. So we've got more than enough in there probably for our 4 marks, but hopefully you can see from that little example just how to get this question nailed quickly and move on. Remember, about 5 to 6 minutes max if we can help it. All right. So let's have a little look at some other possible consequences of the Hungarian uprising. As we alluded to in our model answer, the Soviet Union was even stronger in Eastern Europe than ever before, as now all the satellite states they knew they wouldn't receive any help from the West other than taking refugees or offering some money in the form of the Marshall Aid. There was no point in them ever stepping out of line ever again. Relations between East and West were damaged completely. Despite a relatively positive start to Khrushchev's reign, promising peaceful coexistence, he grew angry at the USA, encouraging a Warsaw-Pact country to break away. So remember that Khrushchev's came in here and he's done his de-Stalinization. He's essentially said, I don't like you, you don't like me, so we're going to try to peacefully coexist. That didn't last very long. Probably rightly so, that Khrushchev was annoyed that America was essentially telling these communist countries to rebel. As it was, they said it on Radio Free Europe and elsewhere, and then when it came down to it, as we've seen in Hungary, they didn't actually follow up with the promises. Probably makes the Truman Doctrine look a little bit weak as well, even though, to be fair, it wasn't Truman's fault because Truman's not the president at this time. It certainly has made America look quite weak, though. The Soviet Union has also showed, or Khrushchev has also showed, that he is prepared to use force and to keep control, whatever that takes. There's quite a brutal response, as we've seen. Maybe that has made America maybe think twice a little bit about anything it might do next. So quite an important consequence, really, of the uprising. And then similarly, the reputation of the West has been damaged. The USA, as we've said, had encouraged rebellion against the Soviet control and then failed to support Hungary. The other satellite states also lost trust in the USA. Hungary expected armed support, not just an offer of Marshall Aid, and the West was taking refugees. That's all they've done. So reputationally, I suppose the damage has been done to the West. The Eastern countries will probably never trust them again. And then that's proven again, remember in 1968, in the Czech uprising, absolutely once again, no US support despite strong words of condemnation. Okay, so that's overall the consequences of Hungary, what you could have said, but I think the model answer that we've written definitely gives us more than enough to get our 4 marks. So the other consequence question, you've got, another 4 marker, is about Yalta. So again, same 6 to 7 minutes, a little bit less if you can help it, but that should be fine. So this is the second conference of the World War II conferences. So some considerations as previous, a consequence happens after the event. So don't be talking about things that are not important. In this case, with a conference, it's a little bit easier because it's a meeting, and we know there's loads of meetings and loads of summits. Quite an obvious thing to do when discussing these things in any of the questions, but especially question 1, is a consequence will generally be what they agree on. Was it a positive meeting or summit? Was it a negative? Was it half and half? So if you know your meetings and summits, that's probably your starting point. So your opening sentence should be something along the lines of, as you'll see in a sec, this meeting was generally successful, and then give examples of why it was successful, or vice versa. So because it is a meeting, this should be a little bit easier, I think, than the Hungarian one. All right, so double animation. So explain one consequence of the Yalta Conference in 1945. So again, we want to start with our really obvious opening point. One consequence of the Yalta Conference was the overall success, with the Grand Alliance agreeing on several key areas. So it's quite clear to the examiner that he's going to expect, or she's going to expect, to see some examples in this paragraph now of the overall agreements that the Grand Alliance made, and the fact that that was a success, because that's what I've chosen to talk about. Okay, so let's go on and see. The Grand Alliance met at Yalta in 1945 to decide what to do with post-war Europe. It was clear Germany was close to defeat. As a result, so we're highlighting our connectives again, despite some tension from Stalin about the Soviet zone, they agreed that Germany would be split into 4 zones, each controlled by the Allies, working together. A further agreement was on reparations for the war damage. It was agreed that Germany would pay $20 billion, with $10 billion going to the Soviet Union and $10 billion divided between Britain, France and the USA. Consequently, Yalta ended with the Grand Alliance still relatively strong, showing Yalta to have been an overall success. So I'm linking back to the initial point that I've made, and we've got a good 2 or 3 strong examples of what they agreed on. So hopefully that is quite clear of the overall positive of the Yalta conference. But here are some other things that you may have talked about in this question. You could choose to discuss the disagreements or the lack of trust at Yalta, leading to tensions within the Grand Alliance. So again, it also depends on your confidence. So in this conference, as well as those positive things that I've just mentioned in the model answer, remember that the USSR wanted 16 countries in this new United Nations, whereas Roosevelt and Churchill were very suspicious that that would give the East too much control, or give Russia too much control of the East, leading to tensions. But in the end, they agreed to reluctantly have just 3, USSR, Belarus and Ukraine. So that's a good example of a disagreement. Even though they agreed in the end, there's still some tension there, depending on the tone of your answer. There was also some suspicion about Stalin's influence in Eastern Europe, as whether they would have these free and fair elections without interference from Stalin. There is tension here, as Churchill doesn't trust Stalin, but Stalin felt undermined that this was even up for consideration. Basically, I think he felt probably that he was being accused of interfering. As we know, history proved Churchill correct. But at the time of the conference, Stalin was a little bit miffed that he was sort of being suggested that he would go back on his word. Poland being the main country where this was an issue with the Grand Alliance, because Stalin was able to keep parts of Poland because he freed them from the Nazis, but he wanted to influence, shall we say, those elections. Stalin still felt that was free and fair. The people were still going to vote for their own, whereas the USA were absolutely not keen on him influencing at all. So you could maybe talk about that as well as a bit of a negative. So there's some important things to think about for Yalta. Lots happened, mostly good. Remember, Hitler is on the ropes at this point. The Nazis are clearly losing. It's almost a matter of time now. So the relations are good in the sense that they're winning, but there's some cracks appearing in the Grand Alliance, definitely. All right. Then you could also briefly throw in as well, it's probably a bit harder to get 4 marks out of, that there was slight tension that Stalin felt the Soviet zone of Germany in the split wasn't as valuable as the Western zones in terms of industry and agriculture. Probably a little bit more marshy over in the Soviet zones. Remember as well from the Germany course that over in the Western zones, the Ruhr and the Rhineland, they were quite important, weren't they, for industry, and they're in the Western zone. So maybe Stalin had a bit of a point there in what he got. So there'll be more on that in question 3 when we look at Potsdam. So with that said then, that's the first question out of the way, 4 marks each. So we move on to the narrative. I personally think this is a great question, probably one of the best questions in all of your exam papers. Some really clear and easy techniques. If you stick to them, then you should be okay. So remember, this narrative question is worth 8 marks as well, and you need to make sure you get a beginning, a middle, and an end. So for us, this is what you're generally doing okay, or generally missing out on. You must make sure that you write this narrative in the correct order. It's got to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you get your paragraphs the wrong way around, it will severely impact your mark, even if what you write is correct. And you should try and also have a bit of a logical end to the narrative as well, if you can. Okay, always, as always with Edexcel, our exam board, you'll be given 2 bullet points to help. This is in every paper, and you need to add the 3rd of your own. In this case, though, you need to think a little bit more carefully. More often than not, they're just offering suggestions, but with this one, they'll give you either the beginning, middle, or end, and then you have to decide which bullet point is missing. And that's where your chronological understanding is important for the Cold War. So when you're revising timelines, timelines, and timelines, and then timelines again, that is how you need to get your head around the Cold War. So, as with all our papers, the language that you use to signpost to the examiner is vital. So please start each paragraph appropriately. As you're writing a narrative here, or a bit of a story, our first paragraph should probably start with firstly, or initially. This makes it clear, doesn't it? This is the beginning of your story. Paragraph 2 should then start with something like following from, and like in English probably, or certainly when you were much younger and you wrote stories, you had to try and link your paragraphs. Definitely in this question, you need to try and start paragraph 2 with whatever you ended paragraph 3 with. You'll hopefully see it in the model answer in a sec. And then the same with paragraph 3, something like finally, in response to. So you're saying finally, you're telling the examiner this is the last bit of your narrative, and you're trying to link back to however you ended paragraph 2. Quite English-like that is. And then as always in the Cold War paper, remember your paragraphs should have several connectives. Even if you're talking about each even you're talking about what is leading to another, this led to that, this was important because. Okay, so those connectives are really important. And your tension words, as always, very important in this question, much more important than in question 1 and 3, but good habits and good practices get them in anyway. Worsened, increased, provoked, improved, raised tensions, deteriorated relations, etc. For the narrative, you need to make sure that they are in each paragraph. Okay, so as our narrative today is about Berlin, the first Berlin crisis, let's have a little look. All right, oh yeah, just before we do that, about 18 minutes on this, maybe 15 if you can get away with it, and then maybe a little bit of time at the end, but no more than 18. So, Berlin crisis specific feedback. That last page was just generally feedback on the question. Make sure we're not getting these things wrong. Please don't confuse your Berlins. Happened a couple of times where we're talking about the Berlin Wall. Just try and remember, the easiest way I think to remember that is there's no wall in the 40s, which is when this question is set, so look at the date of the question. And remember that the whole wall thing was related about John F. Kennedy, and we know that Kennedy was killed in the 60s, and he was around in the 60s with all of those things, the civil rights movement. So just remember, if there's no JFK or no 60s, then there's no wall. Remember that Kennedy said a wall is better than a war. So Kennedy 60s, not 40s. It's important because obviously you're going to lose marks, but also means your narrative is going to be very wrong. Okay, so this crisis only relates to West Berlin, not West Germany. That is a consequence of this crisis, definitely, but this is about West Berlin only. So please make sure you're referring to West Berlin in almost everything that you're saying. And make sure you're referencing in this the access was to West Berlin, not East Berlin. The Soviet Union have access to East Berlin because, remember, Berlin is in the Soviet zone. So this is about West Berlin and getting access to them. Remember, at the beginning of this story should be the creation of Trizonia. The middle of the story is the blockade, and the end of this narrative should be the airlift and creation of West Germany. Okay, so this is our question and the 2 bullet points they've given us. So they've given us Western zones uniting, so that's the beginning, and they've given us the airlift, so that's the end. So you need to pick the 3rd bullet point in this case, which is going to be the middle, and we're going to do the Berlin blockade. Okay, so just to remind you a little bit about the state of Germany following the conferences. So you can see that Berlin in 1945 is in the Soviet zone. So in order for us to get any of our supplies into West Berlin, we're going to have to go through the Soviet zone. So for the next couple of years, it's going to be quite easy on road, on rail. But then when Stalin decides to blockade, the only way to get in is to fly from the Western zones, or Trizonia as it becomes, into West Berlin. We have to fly over the Soviet zone. So hopefully that makes it clear, these pictures, just remind you a little bit of that. Of course, there's always a risk if we're flying over the Soviet zone that they might shoot the planes down. Now, obviously, if they do that, that could lead to some serious hot war. And it's not really in Stalin's interest at this point of the course because he does not have nukes yet. Okay, so let's see. Okay. Firstly, the Berlin crisis began with the creation of Trizonia. So we've seen there straight away in our opening sentence. We're telling the examiner this is our first bit of our narrative today. The Grand Alliance had met during World War II to discuss what to do with Germany post-war. It was agreed by all that they would take temporary control of Germany by splitting it into 4 zones, all working together with one economy. You'll see shortly why that might rightly have upset Stalin. Working together? Nope. And with one economy? Nope. So let's tell the examiner, or show the examiner, how we're going to get to that highly tense point. So in 1947, Britain and the USA joined their zones, creating Bizonia. This led to Stalin becoming incensed, as this wasn't what they'd agreed at Potsdam. France then joined Bizonia, raising tensions even further, creating Trizonia, and Stalin was furious. He felt the West were ganging up on him and making communism look weak. Following this, just to make things even more strained, Trizonia created a new currency, the Deutschmark, which was funded by Marshall Aid, further deteriorating trust, and Trizonia was economically stronger than the USSR zone, undermining communism in Stalin's eyes. Stalin responded aggressively by blocking entry to West Berlin. So we've ended this paragraph with hopefully a really nice, clear start to paragraph 2. The middle. Now again, this image will hopefully remind you about why the Berlin blockade is so important. You can see the western zones, Trizonia, and the ways in to West Berlin. If this was on the road and the rail, we'd have to go through the red Soviet zone. As it is, Stalin is going to block those ways in. So the only thing we can do really is smash through the blockade, potentially leading to hot war, or as we do, the airlift, which is going to make Stalin very angry, because that then means he needs to do something about it. So again, if you need to pause it and have a look at this picture a bit more to see how this works with our 3 air routes in and out of West Berlin, then feel free. Okay, so paragraph 2 is going to start with the Berlin blockade took place in 1948 as Stalin blocked all road and rail routes into West Berlin. Remember our feedback I was telling you about? Some of you were just saying into Berlin. You got to emphasize it into West Berlin. And remember the end of paragraph 1 was introducing the Berlin blockade, so paragraph 2 should really start with that. Then we go on with some detail. So Stalin had hoped that this would starve the West Berliners, as they only had 36 days of food, medicine and fuel left, and the West Berliners would turn on the USA, making them give up Berlin and leave. That's what Stalin hoped, and I'm sure that's probably what would have happened had the US response not been so good. This increased tensions further and worsened, so there's our tension words, the relations of the Grand Alliance. This was seen as an act of aggression by Stalin and the first major conflict of the Cold War. The West knew they needed to act decisively with supplies being low and to not appear weak, but driving through the blockade would escalate the crisis. Tensions were incredibly high, as it was unknown what Truman would do. The West decided to respond by setting up an airlift that would fly from Trizonia over the Soviet zone of Germany and drop supplies into West Berlin. This further infuriated Stalin, now making him have to make a decision on how to respond. So again, we've ended this second paragraph with a nice link into what we can start paragraph 3 with, which will of course be the Berlin airlift. Alright, so just to remind ourselves of the airlift, okay, they flew into West Berlin and dropped supplies. So, okay, let's see how our paragraph's going to look. So finally, the West has begun the Berlin airlift, so linking back to the end of paragraph 2. The Berlin airlift saw the USA and Britain flying 1,000 tons of supplies a day into West Berlin, landing at newly built runways. These supplies were coal, food and medicines. They also positioned bomber aircraft in the UK within striking distance to the USSR, further adding tensions to this crisis, particularly when we think we've got some nuclear capability. You can maybe see why Stalin was a little bit angry. However, this is in response to Stalin's actions, isn't it? The fact the USA had found a non-violent solution to the blockade angered Stalin, but also embarrassed him, making him appear weak, as his attempt at propaganda, trying to make the West look like the aggressors for setting up Trizonia, had backfired big style. So Stalin did then place some weather balloons up in the air to be a nuisance, but stopped short of shooting USA planes out the sky. Those pilots, though, flew in and out of Berlin, West Berlin, not knowing if they were going to get shot out of the sky. In total, I think about 70 people died in the whole year of the Berlin crisis. I know saying 70 is only a small number, like one's too many, isn't it? But in context, and when you think what could have happened. So this further intensified the crisis, as no one knew what Stalin would do, and therefore it was a bit of, let's see what happens. The airlift, though, thankfully, only lasted 10 months, and Stalin backed down, giving the US the first victory of the Cold War, making the West appear stronger. The airlift led to the end of the Grand Alliance and the official creation of West Germany and East Germany, as well as NATO, further straining relations to breaking point, but the crisis was over by 1949. So you can see there by the end of that we've got a clear ending of the narrative and of the Berlin crisis. And of course, if this was a consequence question or even an importance question, we'd then go on to say the importance of East and West Germany, NATO, Warsaw Pact, and the rest, as we know, is Cold War history. All right, so now we get on to question 3, which again, quite similar to question 1. It's relatively done quite well. Good choices made, lacking a bit of detail at places. So let's see some general feedback for this question. The consequences element of it's the same. So like question 1, you should be focusing on the impact of the event, the outcome, the consequence, rather than just what happened. In these questions, you're being asked how important something was for a very specific outcome. Generally, the specific outcome will be relations between the USA and the USSR, relations between East and West generally, so countries within the East and West, international relations, so that involves all countries. It could be Cuba, for example, or it might probably ask you the development of the Cold War. Generally, development means made the Cold War worse. All right, so you'll be given a choice of 3 in this question. You need to do 2. All right, and you should be fine with writing 2 strong peel paragraphs. It's a little bit less techniquey on this one, a little bit less, you know, like the 12 marker where you write 3 peel paragraphs. Just try and get 2 really strong paragraphs, full of facts, full of evidence. But remember, within all of that is you're saying why that was important for whatever the specific outcome is. Okay, generally leading to worsening relations. Use your connectives, use your tension words, and you'll be fine. And about 12 minutes probably on each of these questions. So yeah, give or take. Just make sure you're clock watching in that exam hall. Remember as well, when you're doing your booklets, try and, once you've done a bit of revision for the question you've chose to do, try and do it in the exam times as well, just to get used to that. All right, so here are your 3 options for this particular mock exam. The importance of the Truman Doctrine for development of the Cold War, the importance of the telegrams for the development of the Cold War, and the importance of Potsdam for relations between the USA and the USSR. All right, so the first one is going to be the Truman Doctrine. Generally, this was done quite well. I think some of you maybe have forgotten a little bit. It's a bit of a revision. We'll clear that up. All right, so content that you could include about the Truman Doctrine. So we're going to try and show, remember in this question, how the Truman Doctrine developed the Cold War. Basically, how did that make it worse? All right, so we could start by talking about the Truman Doctrine showed the USA's intention to become involved in Europe and challenge the spread of communism. Remember, they've had this policy of isolationism before the war, where they weren't bothered because it was all the way over in Europe and America was so far away. A good example of this you could talk about is by giving Greece and Turkey the $400 million to stop them going communist, because Britain and France were, skint, so they couldn't help. Remember, this shows Truman, it shows America's worry that there's going to be a spread of red across to Western Europe. Also, it leads to the USA embracing openly, really publicly, a policy of containment, a policy of aggression. This was very clear to the Soviet Union that there would now be a really strong, robust counter to its foreign policy, making maybe Stalin think twice about the things that he was going to do. I suppose it's a little bit like today, isn't it, with the current issues with Ukraine. If a country feels that one of its leaders is quite prepared to do something, it might just make them think twice about the next action. So in this case, Truman's making it very clear there is no doubt that he is going to do what it needs to stop the spread of communism. All right, the Truman Doctrine is also described as 2 halves of the same walnut, remember? So the first half of it is that the USA would use military support where needed. What a shame they didn't do that in Hungary or Czechoslovakia, because that sort of makes them look a little bit weaker. But to be fair, that wasn't Truman's fault. And the second half of the walnut would be its economic aid, so the Marshall Plan. All right, and then Truman's speech made it very clear that the world was now divided into 2, and that in future there was no choice between capitalism and communist, that communist is bad, capitalism is good. He's basically, essentially ending the Grand Alliance, isn't he? All right, and also that Marshall Plan was accepted in the USA and became the other half of that walnut, meaning that even back home they support the US intervention in Europe, spending their money on stopping communism spreading. So all of that there, you could get that into this question, and in your own words, this is just sort of indicative content, the exam board call it, things that you could talk about. All right, and then obviously bring in Stalin's response, Cominform, and Comecon. So there's loads to write in this. We've got 12 minutes or so to just try and get all of this into these paragraphs. All right, all of this is essentially breaking down the Grand Alliance. So the crutch of the matter is that the Truman Doctrine developed the Cold War by ending the Grand Alliance and essentially setting up 2 clear camps in Europe that are now going to be at war with each other. All right. So these little pictures you can pause the video and have a little look at, just to give you a reminder of the thought process going on at both America and Russia, what they're trying to do, and you can then do a little bit more revision and perhaps add to this question in your paper if you didn't do it, or redo the question if you want to have another go after this feedback. All right, so once you're happy with that, you can unpause or just carry on with the model answer. So we'll start this with the Truman Doctrine was important for the development of the Cold War because it essentially started the Cold War with the first direct threat from either side. Hopefully that's quite clear to you that this Truman Doctrine was an attack, wasn't it? It was an act of aggression. In 1947, President Truman made a speech known as the Truman Doctrine, which began a policy of containment aimed at preventing the spread of communism outside of the Eastern Bloc. This was in response to the USSR taking Czechoslovakia, but also remember they've already taken Bulgaria and they've got a few earlier influences, shall we say, in those Eastern elections. This being one country too many taken by Stalin into his Eastern Bloc. So this was important for developing the Cold War because it committed the USA to financial and military involvement in European affairs and ended American isolationism. So just the fact that I've said this was important for developing the Cold War there, you can see that I'm answering the question. And then the end of this first paragraph, this increased the rivalry between the USA and the Soviet Union. Truman stated that the world was divided between East and West, the free and the non-free. So then our second paragraph with just more facts and a bit more explanation, always relating to developing the Cold War. Stalin was threatened by this as he believed America was being aggressive and that they ultimately wanted war with the Soviet Union in order to spread American domination around the world. The Soviet leader was especially threatened by the financial aid America gave to European countries in the form of the Marshall Plan, which he rejected as dollar imperialism, suggesting that USA was spreading capitalism using bribery and again dividing Europe. So Stalin is saying that America's the aggressors here. They're the ones destroying the fragile peace of post-war Europe. I suppose that's up to you as a historian if you agree with Stalin's view or Truman's. So then to finish off this and hopefully get our final couple of marks, Stalin retaliated by introducing Cominform to link communist parties in Eastern Europe. So I suppose remembering that as communist informants, a bit like the FBI in America, just sort of reporting back to Moscow what's happening within the satellite states, and more importantly for America, Comecon, which is their version of the Marshall Plan, clearly not to the same scale, but it also banned the satellite states from accepting money from America and trading with them. So therefore, the Truman Doctrine was important because it divided the world into two clear sides and increased tension between the superpowers, thus ending the Grand Alliance and triggering the Cold War. So hopefully you can see with these two little paragraphs that that's quite a nice answer to do. It's a bit messy. It's not a formal essay like perhaps some of the other papers, but there's enough in there to be getting us ticks. And what we keep doing is we keep saying how this developed the Cold War. All right, so let's have a look at our second choice, the telegrams. So telegram, remember, these are the ways that we communicate across the world at the time. So there was two, one from Russia and one from America. So let's get onto the content that you could have included in this question. Not many people did the telegrams, and I think when you see this video, maybe you might think twice in real life because it seems to be quite an okay topic. So we want to be thinking about how the telegrams developed the Cold War. Remember, made the Cold War worse. The Grand Alliance is still together by the time of the telegrams, just hanging on by a thread, but there is growing suspicion of each other. In order to find out what is going on in each other's countries, they had their ambassadors and in the embassies report back, basically just saying what's going on in each other's countries. All right, so Keenan sent the first, it's called the long telegram because it was a bit longer than normal telegrams are, that essentially said the USSR was spreading communism around Europe and trying to undermine the capitalist way of life. Keenan told Truman that Stalin wouldn't respond if the USA acted aggressively straight away. So basically, Truman, you should. He's encouraging Truman to act strongly in Europe, thinking that Stalin is not suicidal. He said he might be unhappy about it, but he's not gonna challenge you to a hot war. Maybe that was a little bit underestimating Stalin. Who knows? But with that kind of language and that telegram sort of pushing Truman, maybe you can see why Truman did in fact come out with some of his responses. All right. I'd argue that the Truman Doctrine was a direct response of Keenan's long telegram. Okay, so Truman saw the interference in the creation of the satellite states as proof that what Keenan was saying was true. So we've seen Bulgaria fallen, we've seen Stalin influencing some of the elections post-war, and the whole fuss about Poland. So maybe they put 2 and 2 together and got 5, but you can maybe also see that what Keenan was saying sort of did look like it was happening over in Eastern Europe. And then Novikov's telegram, so Novikov is living in Washington, reporting back to Moscow. He said the USA is building this massive army with the intention of using it to destroy the Soviet Union and communism. I suppose, again, the proof is in the pudding that to Stalin, who isn't in America, and he's getting this report from Novikov, and he sees that America's building the biggest peacetime army, he probably thinks to himself, why do you need a peacetime army? The war is finished. You must absolutely be preparing to come and invade Europe. Proven Novikov right. So again, we're always talking about suspicions and paranoia and how these two telegrams have absolutely twisted this up, haven't they, and made everyone a bit worse. So, in context, before we look at a model answer, developing the Cold War as they essentially led to the Truman Doctrine end of the end of the Grand Alliance, the first direct threat of the Cold War, and then of course Stalin's response, which was to build the satellite states, that he would say was a defensive measure because of America's massive army. Just imagine they actually just talk to each other rather than having middlemen. All right, so again, like before, there's two little pictures here for you to pause the video and have a quick look at the general feelings and what they're saying. But we've just talked about that. But if you do need to look at that for your revision, these are a nice little example of how you might do your revision. A little image. Remember, we like some dual coding, but it doesn't have to be paragraphs and paragraphs of notes. It can be a nice little diagram like this. Okay, so if you are pausing it and then you're ready, we'll carry on to a model answer of the telegrams. So we'll start with the telegrams were a key way for the superpowers to find out what was going on in each other's countries. Keenan, the US ambassador, was based in Moscow, and Novikov, the Soviet ambassador, was based in America. At the time of the telegrams, the USSR and America were still allies, although relations were beginning to strain following the World War II conferences. In February 1946, Keenan sent his telegram, the long telegram, back to Washington, telling Truman that the USSR was planning a massive expansion, spreading communism across Europe as well as an attack of capitalism. Then you can see in red, this is our direct relation and link back to the question. This was important in developing the Cold War, as it added to the tensions and fueled Truman's paranoia, leading him to a more aggressive response to Keenan's telegram, which was the Truman Doctrine, further impacting the fragile Grand Alliance. Then we go on to say the telegram was even more important in raising Truman's fears, as Stalin had already taken Bulgaria. And then Winston Churchill then delivered his Iron Curtain speech saying that Stalin had split Europe further, intensifying the Cold War tensions. So although it's not the narrative, you can see there that we can get our tension words in here too. So then, following on from Keenan's telegram, in September of the same year, Novikov, who was based in America, wrote to Stalin telling him that the USA was planning an invasion of Europe and a direct attack on communism. Novikov told Stalin that the US were building a massive military, which added to the tensions and seemed to confirm Novikov's telegram, as Stalin didn't see a need for a large military in peacetime. Again, linking back to our question, this was important in developing the Cold War, as now Stalin felt threatened and so began building his buffer zone, creating the satellite states within a year of the Novikov telegram. It's clear that both the telegrams led their leaders to respond aggressively in response to the information provided. The US built their military and led to Truman's Doctrine, which was a direct threat to Russia, and possibly in response to the long telegram, seeing Stalin one by one taking the satellite states. The telegrams were therefore very important in developing the Cold War because they increased tensions and paranoia for both superpowers, which ultimately led to their future policies. Okay, so again, maybe a little bit more than we even need for our 8 marks, but we're just trying to throw as much into this question 3 as we can, always relaying back to the question though, very, very explicitly and obviously. All right, and then finally, your final option in this was the importance of the Potsdam Conference. So this is the final conference of the World War II conferences. Hitler is dead, the Nazis are defeated. This should be a party. This should be a great conference, shouldn't it? So let's have a little look at the things you could have talked about, okay? So firstly, this question is about relations, not development of the Cold War this time, but relations between the USSR and the USA. So Potsdam is the third and final meeting, as we've just said. The Nazis have been defeated. This is supposed to just put into effect what they agreed at Yalta, and it should be a doddle, really. It should be a cakewalk. All right, so what we need to understand here is that relations are generally okay after Yalta, but that was with President Roosevelt. He's dead by this point and has been replaced by Truman, and Truman hates the Soviet Union and doesn't really hide the fact. So straight away you want to be getting across in your answer here that relations are already strained just due to the attitude of Truman at this meeting. Stalin was probably thinking, oh, okay, things were okay at the last meeting, let's see. And then he meets Truman. All right. Britain has also replaced Churchill, so another superpower of a leader, replaced by Clement Attlee, who only really wants to get on and get home to fix his country. So the dynamics of Potsdam have changed significantly. Stalin was the only one who'd been there throughout all 3 conferences throughout the whole war. So he possibly feels a bit confident, really, like he's the boss because he's been there throughout the whole thing. He's in for a bit of a shock when Truman rocks up. All right, so Truman deliberately waits until day 2 of the conference to test his atomic bomb. Please, please, please note, folks, in this question that Hiroshima was not during Potsdam. They did not drop the bomb on Japan during Potsdam. This was a test of the bomb 2 days into the conference and it was in the desert in America. It doesn't matter where it was, but it wasn't Japan. So please be careful that you don't get that into this question. Remain focused on just Potsdam. All right, so this angered Stalin, as he felt he should have been told about this superpower, this new weapon that they've got, as they are an alliance, aren't they, after all? Truman did it just to show just how powerful America was, and I think possibly put Stalin in his place. All right. There was also more tension related to the compensation agreed at Yalta. Remember that $20 billion? Stalin felt that the USSR had lost more than anyone else in World War II in both men and other damages. Probably true, to be honest. And this compensation was agreed at Potsdam that it would be taken from each of their own zones. So remembering back to our earlier question, just interestingly that it was on the same paper, the Stalin felt the Soviet zone was poorer than the West. Remember the Ruhr and the Rhineland was over in the West. So he had a bit of a moan about that at Potsdam. Truman was having none of it. But in the end, they agreed that from the Western zones, they give the Soviet Union a quarter of their industrial equipment to try and make up for the losses of East Germany. I think a lot of the Eastern zone was quite marshy, not really that good industry or agriculture. The only good thing about the East was it had Berlin. So let's see what else we're thinking about here in this final question. It was agreed that Berlin would also be split into 4 zones. As you know, Germany was split in Yalta, and then the problem with Berlin, so they agreed to split Berlin at Potsdam. So it was in the Soviet zone. This led to a little bit of mistrust and paranoia from both sides. Stalin had hoped that America would just start a new capital over in the West and leave Berlin, but of course that was the eye to the East. And I think it would also have made Truman look quite weak if he backed down. So knowing Truman, like I think we're starting to know Truman, this was more about his ego than anything else. But anyway, we stayed in Berlin, and as we know, Berlin becomes pivotal to the whole Cold War. So as we approach a model answer for this, just a reminder that the United Nations have been set up. That causes a bit of tension in this as well. Remember, Stalin wants 16 countries in the UN. That was a bit of a debate at Yalta, wasn't it? But anyway, it's been set up and it's going ahead, hopefully to stop any future wars. So all in all, with this one, and we're talking about relations, Truman, I think probably rightly being the aggressor in this, was unhappy with the agreement at Yalta that Stalin could keep some of Poland and didn't believe it would remain free and fair in their elections. It was Roosevelt that agreed to that. So Stalin's like, hang on a minute, we've agreed to this, what are you doing? And Truman is like, no, sorry, Roosevelt's dead. I'm now saying I don't want you to have any of Poland. So there's some more tension that you could talk about in this answer as well. It's clear that he's quite right in his paranoia, because Stalin's putting some really powerful communists in some key positions within Poland. And he's also telling Stalin to withdraw the whole Red Army from all of these Eastern European countries that the Russians defeated the Nazis in. So Stalin's been like, whoa, 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 we have defeated the Nazis. We should be in these countries. Truman is obviously having none of that. So just with hopefully the little bit of a reminder here for you in this revision video, you can see that there's again plenty to talk about. Just remain focused on Potsdam. Don't try and get down a rabbit hole about Hiroshima and things like that. Just stick with Potsdam and its impact on relations. If Potsdam was asking you, if this question was asking you about developing the Cold War, then possibly you could maybe talk about Hiroshima a little bit, because it's that then went on to develop the arms race. But I feel like in this case, because the question is asking you specifically about relations, it's just, there's plenty. You've got plenty to talk about just at the conference itself. Okay, so our model answer, as you can see, is here. This will be our last one for this video. So let's see. So Potsdam was pivotal in the changing relations between USA and USSR. Following the Yalta conference, relations were generally good, with Stalin and Roosevelt agreeing on more than they disagreed on. Hitler had also been defeated by the time of Potsdam, so relations should have been good. However, Roosevelt had died and been replaced by President Truman, who hated the Soviet Union. This was important for their relations because they would deteriorate quickly during Potsdam. Truman felt Roosevelt was weak in his dealings with Stalin and was determined to show that the USA was in charge at Potsdam. Truman was particularly aggressive in his stance on Poland. It had been agreed at Yalta that Stalin could keep parts of Poland, but Truman went against this, in fact going further by demanding the Red Army be removed from all Eastern European countries. Stalin felt this was too far, especially as he had freed those countries from the Nazis. Truman felt that Stalin had gone back on his agreement that Poland would have free and fair elections by putting key communists in important positions in the Polish government. All of this caused severe tensions impacting on the relations between the USSR and the USA. It was much worse than at the previous conference. So I've answered the question there, haven't I? I've replied back to the question impacting on relations. Then Truman also waited until the second day of the conference to drop his atomic bomb in a test in the USA. Remember what I've just said, not on Japan. Stalin was furious that Truman hadn't told him about this new superweapon, particularly as they're supposed to be in an alliance. Stalin was jealous and probably concerned, further ruining their relations. So linking back to that question again. Tensions between the USA and the USSR were further worsened by the arguments about their 4 zones agreed at Yalta. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was in the Soviet zone of Germany. Stalin wanted the West to create their own capital, but Truman didn't want to lose his view of the East from Berlin. It was agreed that Berlin would also be split into the same 4 zones. Furthermore, it was also agreed that the compensation of 20 billion decided at Yalta would come out of their own zones. Stalin felt the Soviet zone was less profitable than the Western zones and demanded more compensation, as well as the fact that the USSR had lost the most in World War II. Truman was determined not to give Stalin what he wanted, but in the end they agreed that 1/4 of industrial equipment from the Western zones would be given to Stalin. All of these disagreements severely impacted on relations between the USA and the USSR, and leaving Potsdam and the Grand Alliance was hanging by a thread. Okay, so it's quite clear in there that we've thrown a lot of stuff in this answer, but we've got plenty for our 8 marks, and we've referred to regularly this is affecting relations all the way through. All right, so slightly shorter video, only slightly shorter than the medicine paper. That's because there's a few less questions, but hopefully equally as helpful and detailed to help you reflect on what you wrote in your exam paper, maybe have another go, and to see how this paper is set up. Remember, if for nothing else, if we're looking at these videos, is a little reminder on how to do the questions. All right, as always, please remember that all of our lessons are on our website, stzhistory.com. And if there's anything else that you need, let us know. Wednesdays are drop-ins currently, so just let us know. You're not on your own for this. Hopefully these things are helpful, and I will see you soon. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.